Hello and welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Spanish Blood by Raymond Chandler. Chapter 1. Big John Masters was large, fat, oily. He had sleek blue jowls and very thick fingers on which the knuckles were dimples. His brown hair was combed straight back from his forehead, and he wore a wine-colored suit with patch pockets, a wine-colored tie, a tan silk shirt. There was a lot of red and gold band around the thick brown cigar between his lips. He wrinkled his nose, peeped at his hole card again, tried not to grin. He said, "Hit me again, Dave, and don't hit me with the City Hall." A 4 and a deuce showed. Dave Age looked at them solemnly across the table, looked down at his own hand. He was very tall and thin, with a long bony face and hair the color of wet sand. He held the deck flat on the palm of his hand, turned the top card slowly, and flicked it across the table. It was the Queen of Spades. Big John Masters opened his mouth wide, waved his cigar about, chuckled. "Pay me, Dave." For once, a lady was right. He turned his hole card with a flourish. A 5. Dave Age smiled politely, didn't move. A muted telephone bell rang close to him behind long silk drapes that bordered the very high lancet windows. He took a cigarette out of his mouth and laid it carefully on the edge of a tray on a tabouret beside the card table, reached behind the curtain for the phone. He spoke into the cup with a cool, almost whispering voice, then listened for a long time. Nothing changed in his greenish eyes. No flicker of emotion showed on his narrow face. Masters squirmed, bit hard on his cigar. After a long time, Age said, "Okay, you'll hear from us." He pronged the instrument and put it back behind the curtain. He picked his cigarette up, pulled the lobe of his ear. Masters swore. "What's eating you, for Pete's sake? Gimme $10. Age smiled dryly and leaned back. He reached for a drink, sipped it, put it down, spoke around his cigarette. All his movements were slow, thoughtful, almost absent-minded. He said, "Are we a couple of smart guys, John?" "Yeah, we own the town, but it don't help my blackjack game any. It's just 2 months to election, isn't it, John?" Masters scowled at him, fished in his pocket for a fresh cigar, jammed it into his mouth. "So what? Suppose something happened to our toughest opposition right now. Would that be a good idea or not?" "Huh?" Masters raised eyebrows so thick that his whole face seemed to have to work to push them up. He thought for a moment, sourly. It would be lousy if they didn't catch the guy pronto. Hell, the voters would figure we hired it done. "You're talking about murder, John," Age said patiently. "I didn't say anything about murder." Masters lowered his eyebrows and pulled at a coarse black hair that grew out of his nose. "Well, spit it out." Age smiled, blew a smoke ring, watched it float off and come apart in frail wisps. "I just had a phone call," he said very softly. "Donegan Marr is dead." Masters moved slowly. His whole body moved slowly towards the card table, leaned far over it. When his body couldn't go any farther, his chin came out until his jaw muscles stood out like thick wires. "Huh?" he said thickly. "Huh?" Age nodded, calm as ice. "But you were right about murder, John. It was murder. Just half an hour ago or so, in his office. They don't know who did it yet." Masters shrugged heavily and leaned back. He looked around him with a stupid expression. Very suddenly he began to laugh. His laughter bellowed and roared around the little turret-like room where the 2 men sat, overflowed into an enormous living room beyond, echoed back and forth through a maze of heavy dark furniture, enough standing lamps to light a boulevard, a double row of oil paintings in massive gold frames. Age sat silent. He rubbed his cigarette out slowly in the tray until there was nothing of the fire left but a thick dark smudge. He dusted his bony fingers together and waited. Masters stopped laughing as abruptly as he had begun. The room was very still. Masters looked tired, He mopped his big face. "We got to do something, Dave," he said quietly. "I almost forgot. We got to break this fast. It's dynamite." Age reached behind the curtain again and brought the phone out, pushed it across the table over the scattered cards. "Well, we know how, don't we?" he said calmly. A cunning light shone in Big John Masters' muddy brown eyes. He licked his lips, reached a big hand for the phone. "Yeah," he said purringly. "We do, Dave. We do it that by." He dialed with a thick finger that would hardly go into the holes. Chapter 2. Donegan Marr's face looked cool, neat, poised even then. He was dressed in soft gray flannels, and his hair was the same soft gray color as his suit, brushed back from a ruddy, youngish face. The skin was pale on the frontal bones where the hair would fall when he stood up. The rest of the skin was tanned. He was lying back in a padded blue office chair. A cigar had gone out in a tray with a bronze greyhound on its rim. His left hand dangled beside the chair and his right hand held a gun loosely on the desktop. The polished nails glittered in sunlight from the big closed window behind him. Blood had soaked the left side of his vest, made the gray flannel almost black. He was quite dead, had been dead for some time. A tall man, very brown and slender and silent, leaned against a brown mahogany filing cabinet and looked fixedly at the dead man. His hands were in the pockets of a neat blue serge suit. There was a straw hat on the back of his head, but there was nothing casual about his eyes or his tight, straight mouth. A big sandy-haired man was groping around on the blue rug. He said thickly, stooped over, "No shells, Sam." The dark man didn't move, didn't answer. The other stood up, yawned, looked at the man in the chair. "Hell, this one will stink. 2 months to election. Boy, is this a smack in the puss for somebody." The dark man said slowly, "We went to school together. We used to be buddies. We carried the torch for the same girl. He won, but we stayed good friends, all three of us. He was always a great kid, maybe a shade too smart." The sandy-haired man walked around the room without touching anything. He bent over and sniffed at the gun on the desk, shook his head, said, "Not used, this one." He wrinkled his nose, sniffed at the air. "Air-conditioned, the 3 top floors, soundproof too, high-grade stuff. They tell me this whole building is electric welded, not a rivet in it. Ever hear that, Sam?" The dark man shook his head slowly. "Wonder where the help was," the sandy-haired man went on. "A big shot like him would have more than one girl." The dark man shook his head again. "That's all, I guess. She was out to lunch. He was a lone wolf, Pete, sharp as a weasel. In a few more years he'd have taken the town over." The sandy-haired man was behind the desk now, almost leaning over the dead man's shoulder. He was looking down at a leather-backed appointment pad with buff leaves. He said slowly, "Somebody named Imlay was due here at 12:15. Only date on the pad." He glanced at a cheap watch on his wrist. 1:30, long gone. Who's Imlay? Say, wait a minute. There's an assistant DA named Imlay. He's running for judge on the Masters age ticket. Do you figure? There was a sharp knock on the door. The office was so long that the two men had to think a moment before they placed which of the 3 doors it was. Then the sandy-haired man went towards the most distant of them, saying over his shoulder, "Me's man, maybe. Leak this to your favorite newshock and you're out a job. Am I right?" The dark man didn't answer. He moved slowly to the desk, leaned forward a little, spoke softly to the dead man. "Goodbye, Donnie. Just let it all go. I'll take care of it. I'll take care of Belle." The door at the end of the office opened, and a brisk man with a bag came in, trotted down the blue carpet and put his bag on the desk. The sandy-haired man shut the door against a bulge of faces. He strolled back to the desk. The brisk man cocked his head on one side, examining the corpse. "2 of them," he muttered. "Look like about 2 hard slugs, close to the heart but not touching. He must have died pretty soon, maybe a minute or two. The dark man made a disgusted sound and walked to the window, stood with his back to the room, looking out at the tops of high buildings and a warm blue sky. The sandy-haired man watched the examiner lift a dead eyelid. He said, "Wish the powder guy would get here. I want to use the phone. This Imlay." The dark man turned his head slightly with a dull smile. "Use it. This isn't going to be any mystery." "Oh, I don't know," the Mies man said, flexing a wrist, then holding the back of his hand against the skin of the dead man's face. "Might not be so damn political as you think, De La Guerra. He's a good-looking stiff." The sandy-haired man took hold of the phone gingerly, with a handkerchief, laid the receiver down, dialed, picked the receiver up with the handkerchief and put it to his ear. After a moment he snapped his chin down, said, "Pete Marcus, wake the inspector." He yawned, waited again, then spoke in a different tone. "Marcus and De La Guerra, Inspector, from Donegan Marr's office. No printer cameramen here yet." "Huh? Holding off till the commissioner gets here?" "Okay, yeah, he's here." The dark man turned. The man at the phone gestured at him. "Take it Spanish." Sam De La Guerra took the phone. Ignoring the careful handkerchief, listened. His face got hard. He said quietly, "Sure, I knew him, but I didn't sleep with him. Nobody's here but his secretary, a girl. She phoned the alarm in. There's a name on a pad, Imlay, a 12:15 appointment. No, we haven't touched anything yet. No. Okay, right away." He hung up so slowly that the click of the instrument was barely audible. His hand stayed on it, then fell suddenly and heavily to his side. His voice was thick. "I'm called off it, Pete. You're to hold it down until Commissioner Drew gets here. Nobody gets in. White, black, or Cherokee Indian." "What you called in for?" The sandy-haired man yelped angrily. "Don't know. It's an order," De La Guerra said tonelessly. The Mies man stopped writing on a form pad to look curiously at De La Guerra, with a sharp sidelong look. De La Guerra crossed the office and went through the communicating door. There was a smaller office outside, partly partitioned off for a waiting room, with a group of leather chairs and a table with magazines. Inside a counter was a typewriter desk, a safe, some filing cabinets. A small dark girl sat at the desk with her head down on a wadded handkerchief. Her hat was crooked on her head. Her shoulders jerked and her thick sobs were like panting. De La Guerra patted her shoulder. She looked up at him with a tear-bloated face, a twisted mouth. He smiled down at her questioning face, said gently, "Did you call Mrs. Marr yet?" She nodded, speechless, shaken with rough sobs. He patted her shoulder again, stood a moment beside her, then went on out, with his mouth tight and a hard, dark glitter in his black eyes. Chapter 3. The big English house stood a long way back from the narrow, winding ribbon of concrete that was called De Neve Lane. The lawn had rather long grass with a curving path of stepping stones half hidden in it. There was a gable over the front door and ivy on the wall. Trees grew all around the house, close to it, made it a little dark and remote. All the houses in De Neve Lane had that same calculated air of neglect, but the tall green hedge that hid the driveway and the garages was trimmed as carefully as a French poodle, and there was nothing dark or mysterious about the mass of yellow and flame-colored gladioli that flared at the opposite end of the lawn. De La Guerra got out of a tan-colored Cadillac touring car that had no top. It was an old model, heavy and dirty. A taut canvas formed a deck over the back part of the car. He wore a white linen cap and dark glasses, and had changed his blue serge for a gray cloth outing suit with a jerkin-style zipper jacket. He didn't look very much like a cop. He hadn't looked very much like a cop in Donegan Marr's office. He walked slowly up the path of stepping stones, touched a brass knocker on the front door of the house, then didn't knock with it. He pushed a bell at the side, almost hidden by the ivy. There was a long wait. It was very warm, very silent. Bees droned over the warm, bright grass. There was the distant whirring of a lawnmower. The door opened slowly and a black face looked out at him. A long, sad black face with tear streaks on its lavender face powder. The black face almost smiled, said haltingly, "Hello there, Mr. Sam. It's sure good to see you." De la Guerra took his cap off, swung the dark glasses at his side. He said, "Hello, Minnie. I'm sorry. I've got to see Mrs. Marr." "Sure. Come right in, Mr. Sam." The maid stood aside and he went into a shadowy hall with a tile floor. "No reporters yet?" The girl shook her head slowly. Her warm brown eyes were stunned, doped with shock. "Ain't been nobody yet." "She ain't been in long. She ain't said a word. She just stand there in that there sunroom that ain't got no sun." De la Guerra nodded, said, "Don't talk to anybody, Minnie. They're trying to keep this quiet for a while, out of the papers." "Ah, sure won't, Mr. Sam. Not nohow." De la Guerra smiled at her, walked noiselessly on crepe soles along the tiled hall to the back of the house, turned into another hall just like it at right angles. He knocked at a door. There was no answer. He turned the knob and went into a long, narrow room that was dim in spite of many windows. Trees grew close to the windows, pressing their leaves against the glass. Some of the windows were masked by long cretonne drapes. The tall girl in the middle of the room didn't look at him. She stood motionless, rigid. She stared at the windows. Her hands were tightly clenched at her sides. She had red-brown hair that seemed to gather all the light there was and make a soft halo around her coldly beautiful face. She wore a sportily cut blue velvet ensemble with patch pockets. A white handkerchief with a blue border stuck out of the breast pocket, arranged carefully in points, like a foppish man's handkerchief. De la Guerra waited, letting his eyes get used to the dimness. After a while the girl spoke through the silence, in a low, husky voice. "Well, they got him, Sam. They got him at last. Was he so much hated?" De la Guerra said softly, "He was in a tough racket, Belle. I guess he played it as clean as he could, but he couldn't help but make enemies." She turned her head slowly and looked at him. Lights shifted in her hair, gold glinted in it. Her eyes were vividly, startlingly blue. Her voice faltered a little, saying, "Who killed him, Sam? Have they any ideas?" De la Guerra nodded slowly, sat down in a wicker chair, swung his cap and glasses between his knees. "Yeah, we think we know who did it. A man named Imlay, an assistant in the DA's office." "My God," the girl breathed. "What's this rotten city coming to?" De la Guerra went on tonelessly. "It was like this, if you're sure you want to know. Yet." "I do, Sam." His eyes stare at me from the wall wherever I look, asking me to do something. He was pretty swell to me, Sam. We had our troubles, of course, but they didn't mean anything. De la Guerra said, "This Imlay is running for judge with the backing of the Masters Adj Group. He's in the gay 40s, and it seems he's been playing house with a nightclub number called Stella La Motte. Somehow, someway, photos were taken of them together, very drunk and undressed. Donnie got the photos, Belle. They were found in his desk. According to his desk pad, he had a date with Imlay at 12:15. We figure they had a row and Imlay beat him to the punch." "You found those photos, Sam?" the girl asked very quietly. He shook his head, smiled crookedly. "No, if I had, I guess I might have ditched them. Commissioner Drew found them after I was pulled off the investigation." Her head jerked at him. Her vivid blue eyes got wide. "Pulled off the investigation? You, Donnie's friend?" "Yeah, don't take it too big. I'm a cop, Belle. After all, I take orders." She didn't speak, didn't look at him any more. After a little while, he said, "I'd like to have the keys to your cabin at Puma Lake. I'm detailed to go up there and look around, see if there's any evidence. Donnie had conferences there. Something changed in the girl's face. It got almost contemptuous. Her voice was empty. I'll get them. But you won't find anything there. If you're helping them to find dirt on Donnie so they can clear this Imlay person. He smiled a little, shook his head slowly. His eyes were very deep, very sad. That's crazy talk, kid. I turned my badge in before I did that. I see. She walked past him to the door, went out of the room. He sat quite still while she was gone, looked at the wall with an empty stare. There was a hurt look on his face. He swore very softly under his breath. The girl came back, walked up to him and held her hand out. Something tinkled into his palm. The keys, copper. De la Guerra stood up, dropped the keys into a pocket. His face got wooden. Belle Mar went over to a table and her nails scratched harshly on a cloisonne box, getting a cigarette out of it. With her back turned, she said, I don't think you'll have any luck, as I said. It's too bad you've only got blackmailing on him so far. De la Guerra breathed out slowly, stood a moment, then turned away. Okay, he said softly. His voice was quite offhand now, as if it was a nice day, as if nobody had been killed. At the door he turned again. I'll see you when I get back, Belle. Maybe you'll feel better. She didn't answer, didn't move. She held the unlighted cigarette rigidly in front of her mouth, close to it. After a moment, De la Guerra went on. You ought to know how I feel about it. Donnie and I were like brothers once. I heard you were not getting on so well with him. I'm glad as all hell that was wrong. But don't let yourself get too hard, Belle. There's nothing to be hard about with me. He waited a few seconds, staring at her back. When she still didn't move or speak, he went on out. Chapter 4. A narrow, rocky road dropped down from the highway and ran along the flank of the hill above the lake. The tops of cabins showed here and there among the pines. An open shed was cut into the side of the hill. De la Guerra put his dusty Cadillac under it and climbed down a narrow path towards the water. The lake was deep blue but very low. 2 or 3 canoes drifted about on it, and the chugging of an outboard motor sounded in the distance, around a bend. He went along between thick walls of undergrowth, walking on pine needles, turned around a stump and crossed a small rustic bridge to the Mar cabin. It was built of half-round logs and had a wide porch on the lakeside. It looked very lonely and empty. The spring that ran under the bridge curved around beside the house, and one end of the porch dropped down sheer to the big flat stones through which the water trickled. The stones would be covered when the water was high, in the spring. De la Guerra went up wooden steps and took the keys out of his pocket, unlocked the heavy front door, then stood on the porch a little while and lit a cigarette before he went in. It was very still, very pleasant, very cool and clear after the heat of the city. A mountain blue jay sat on a stump and pecked at its wings. Somebody far out on the lake fooled with a ukulele. He went into the cabin. He looked at some dusty antlers, a big rough table splattered with magazines, an old-fashioned battery-type radio, a box-shaped phonograph with a disheveled pile of records beside it. There were tall glasses that hadn't been washed, and a half bottle of scotch beside them, on a table near the big stone fireplace. A car went along the road up above and stopped somewhere not far off. De la Guerra frowned around, said "Stall" under his breath, with a defeated feeling. There wasn't any sense in it. A man like Donegan Marr wouldn't leave anything that mattered in a mountain cabin. He looked into a couple of bedrooms, one just a shakedown with a couple of cots, one better furnished, with a make-up bed and a pair of women's gaudy pajamas tossed across it. They didn't look quite like Belle Mar's. At the back there was a small kitchen with a gasoline stove and a wood stove. He opened the back door with another key and stepped out on a small porch flush with the ground, near a big pile of cordwood and a double-bitted axe on a chopping block. He saw the flies. A wooden walk went down the side of the house to a woodshed under it. A beam of sunlight had slipped through the trees and lay across the walk. In the sunlight there, a clotted mass of flies festered on something brownish, sticky. The flies didn't want to move. De la Guerra bent down, then put his hand down and touched the sticky place, sniffed at his finger. His face got shocked and stiff. There was another smaller patch of the brownish stuff farther on, in the shade outside the door of the shed. He took the keys out of his pocket very quickly and found the one that unlocked the big padlock of the woodshed. He yanked the door open. There was a big loose pile of cordwood inside. Not split wood, cordwood. Not stacked, just thrown in anyhow. De la Guerra began to toss the big rough pieces to one side. After he had thrown a lot of it aside, he was able to reach down and take hold of 2 cold, stiff ankles in lisle socks and drag the dead man out into the light. He was a slender man, neither tall nor short, in a well-cut basket weave suit. His small, neat shoes were polished, a little dust over the polish. He didn't have any face much. It was broken to pulp by a terrific smash. The top of his head was split open, and brains and blood were mixed in the thin grayish-brown hair. De la Guerra straightened quickly and went back into the house to where the half-bottle of scotch stood on the table in the living room. He uncorked it, drank from the neck, waited a moment, drank again. He said, "Phew," out loud, and shivered as the whiskey whipped at his nerves. He went back to the woodshed, leaned down again as an automobile motor started up somewhere. He stiffened. The motor swelled in sound. Then the sound faded and there was silence again. De la Guerra shrugged, went through the dead man's pockets. They were empty. One of them, with cleaner's marks on it, probably had been cut away. The tailor's label had been cut from the inside pocket of the coat, leaving ragged stitches. The man was stiff. He might have been dead 24 hours, not more. The blood on his face had coagulated thickly but had not dried completely. De la Guerra squatted beside him for a little while, looking at the bright glitter of Puma Lake, the distant flash of a paddle from a canoe. Then he went back into the woodshed and pawed around for a heavy block of wood, with a great deal of blood on it. Didn't find one. He went back into the house and out on the front porch, went to the end of the porch, stared down the drop, then at the big flat stones in the spring. "Yeah," he said softly. There were flies clotted on 2 of the stones, a lot of flies. He hadn't noticed them before. The drop was about 30 feet, enough to smash a man's head open if he landed just right. He sat down in one of the big rockers and smoked for several minutes without moving. His face was still with thought, his black eyes withdrawn and remote. There was a tight, hard smile, ever so faintly sardonic, at the corners of his mouth. At the end of that, he went silently back through the house and dragged the dead man into the woodshed again, covered him up loosely with the wood. He locked the woodshed, locked the house up, went back along the narrow, steep path to the road and to his car. It was past 6 o'clock, but the sun was still bright as he drove off. Chapter 5. An old store counter served as bar in the roadside beer stube. 3 low stools stood against it. De la Guerra sat on the end one near the door, looked at the foamy inside of an empty beer glass. The bartender was a dark kid in overalls, with shy eyes and lank hair. He stuttered. He said, Should I draw you another G-glass, mister?" De la Guerra shook his head, stood up off the stool. "Racket beer, sonny," he said sadly. "Tasteless as a roadhouse blonde. P. Portola B. brew, mister. Supposed to be the B best. The worst. You use it or you don't have a license. So long, sonny." He went across to the screen door, looked out at the sunny highway on which the shadows were getting quite long. Beyond the concrete there was a graveled space edged by a white fence of 4x4s. There were 2 cars parked there, De la Guerra's old Cadillac and a dusty, hard-bitten Ford. A tall, thin man in khaki whipcord stood beside the Cadillac, looking at it. De la Guerra got a bulldog pipe out, filled it half full from a zipper pouch, lit it with slow care and flicked the match into the corner. Then he stiffened a little, looking out through the screen. The tall, thin man was unsnapping the canvas that covered the back part of De la Guerra's car. He rolled part of it back, stood peering down in the space underneath. De la Guerra opened the screen door softly and walked in long, loose strides across the concrete of the highway. His crepe soles made sound on the gravel beyond, but the thin man didn't turn. De la Guerra came up beside him. "Thought I noticed you behind me," he said dully. "What's the grift?" The man turned without any haste. He had a long, sour face, eyes the color of seaweed. His coat was open, pushed back by a hand on a left hip. That showed a gun-worn butt to the front in a belt holster, cavalry style. He looked De la Guerra up and down with a faint, crooked smile. "This your crate?" "What do you think?" The thin man pulled his coat back farther and showed a bronze badge on his pocket. "I think I'm a Toluca County game warden, mister. I think this ain't deer hunting time, and it ain't ever deer hunting time for Duz." De la Guerra lowered his eyes very slowly, looked into the back of his car, bending over to see past the canvas. The body of a young deer lay there on some junk beside a rifle. The soft eyes of the dead animal, unglazed by death, seemed to look at him with a gentle reproach. There was dried blood on the doe's slender neck. De la Guerra straightened, said gently, "That's damn cute. Got a hunting license?" "I don't hunt," De la Guerra said. "Wouldn't help much. I see you got a rifle. I'm a cop." "Oh, cop, huh? Would you have a badge?" "I would." De la Guerra reached into his breast pocket, got the badge out, rubbed it on his sleeve, held it in the palm of his hand. The thin game warden stared down at it, licking his lips. "Detective lieutenant, huh? City police?" His face got distant and lazy. "Okay, Lieutenant. We'll ride about 10 miles downgrade in your heap. I'll thumb a ride back to mine." De la Guerra put the badge away, knocked his pipe out carefully, stamped the embers into the gravel. He replaced the canvas loosely. "Pinched?" he asked gravely. "Pinched, Lieutenant? Let's go." He got in under the wheel of the Cadillac. The thin warden went around the other side, got in beside him. De la Guerra started the car, backed around and started off down the smooth concrete of the highway. The valley was a deep haze in the distance. Beyond the haze, other peaks were enormous on the skyline. De la Guerra coasted the big car easily, without haste. The two men stared straight before them without speaking. After a long time, De la Guerra said, "I didn't know they had deer at Puma Lake. That's as far as I've been." "There's a reservation by there, Lieutenant," the warden said calmly. He stared through the dusty windshield. "Part of the Toluca County forest, or wouldn't you know that?" De la Guerra said, "I guess I wouldn't know it. I never shot a deer in my life. Police work hasn't made me that tough." The warden grinned, said nothing. The highway went through a saddle. Then the drop was on the right side of the highway. Little canyons began to open out into the hills on the left. Some of them had rough roads in them, half overgrown, with wheel tracks. De la Guerra swung the big car hard and suddenly to the left, shot it into a cleared space of reddish earth and dry grass, slammed the brake on. The car skidded, swayed, ground to a lurching stop. The warden was flung violently to the right, then forward against the windshield. He cursed, jerked up straight, and threw his right hand across his body at the holstered gun. De la Guerra took hold of a thin, hard wrist and twisted it sharply towards the man's body. The warden's face whitened behind the tan. His left hand fumbled at the holster, then relaxed. He spoke in a tight, hurt voice. "Making it worse, copper. I got a phone tip at Salt Springs. Described your car, said where it was, said there was a doe carcass in it." De la Guerra loosed the wrist, snapped the belt holster open, and jerked the Colt out of it. He tossed the gun from the car. "Get out, County. Thumb that ride you spoke of. What's the matter? Can't you live on your salary anymore? You planted it yourself back at Puma Lake, you goddamn chiseler." The warden got out slowly, stood on the ground with his face blank, his jaw loose and slack. "Tough guy," he muttered. "You'll be sorry for this, copper. I'll swear a complaint." De La Guerra slid across the seat, got out of the right-hand door. He stood close to the warden, said very slowly, "Maybe I'm wrong, mister. Maybe you did get a call. Maybe you did." He swung the doe's body out of the car, laid it down on the ground, watching the warden. The thin man didn't move, didn't try to get near his gun lying on the grass a dozen feet away. His seaweed eyes were dull, very cold. De La Guerra got back into the Cadillac, snapped the brake off, started the engine. He backed to the highway. The warden still didn't make a move. The Cadillac leaped forward, shot down the grade, out of sight. When it was quite gone, the warden picked his gun up and holstered it, dragged the doe behind some bushes, and started to walk back along the highway towards the crest of the grade. Chapter 6. The girl at the desk in the Kenworthy said, "This man called you 3 times, Lieutenant, but he wouldn't give a number. A lady called twice. Wouldn't leave name or number." De La Guerra took 3 slips of paper from her, read the name Joey Chill on them, and the various times. He picked up a couple of letters, touched his cap to the desk girl, and got into the automatic elevator. He got off at 4, walked down a narrow, quiet corridor, unlocked a door. Without switching on any lights, he went across to a big French window, opened it wide, stood there looking at the thick dark sky, the flash of neon lights, the stabbing beams of headlamps on Ortega Boulevard, 2 blocks over. He lit a cigarette and smoked half of it without moving. His face in the dark was very long, very troubled. Finally, he left the window and went into a small bedroom, switched on a table lamp, and undressed to the skin. He got under the shower, toweled himself, put on clean linen, and went into the kitchenette to mix a drink. He sipped that and smoked another cigarette while he finished dressing. The telephone in the living room rang as he was strapping on his holster. It was Belle Marr. Her voice was blurred and throaty, as if she had been crying for hours. "I'm so glad to get you, Sam. I didn't mean the way I talked. I was shocked and confused, absolutely wild inside." "You knew that, didn't you, Sam?" "Sure, kid," De La Guerra said. "Think nothing of it. Anyway, you were right. I just got back from Puma Lake, and I think I was just sent up there to get rid of me. You're all I have now, Sam. You won't let them hurt you, will you?" "Who?" "You know, I'm no fool, Sam. I know this was all a plot, a vile political plot to get rid of him." De La Guerra held the phone very tight. His mouth felt stiff and hard. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he said, "It might be just what it looks like, Belle, a quarrel over those pictures. After all, Donnie had a right to tell a guy like that to get off the ticket. That wasn't blackmail, and he had a gun in his hand, you know. Come out and see me when you can, Sam." Her voice lingered with a spent emotion, a note of wistfulness. He drummed on the desk, hesitated again, said, "Sure. When was anybody at Puma Lake last, at the cabin?" "I don't know. I haven't been there in a year. He went, alone. Perhaps he met people there. I don't know." He said something vaguely, after a moment said goodbye and hung up. He stared at the wall over the writing desk. There was a fresh light in his eyes, a hard glint. His whole face was tight, not doubtful anymore. He went back to the bedroom for his coat and straw hat. On the way out, he picked up the 3 telephone slips with the name Joey Chill on them, tore them into small pieces, and burned the pieces in an ashtray. Chapter 7. Pete Marcus, the big, sandy-haired Dick, sat sidewise at a small littered desk in a bare office in which there were 2 such desks, faced to opposite walls. The other desk was neat and tidy, had a green blotter with an onyx pen set, a small brass calendar, and an abalone shell for an ashtray. A round straw cushion that looked something like a target was propped on end in a straight chair by the window. Pete Marcus had a handful of bank pens in his left hand, and he was flipping them at the cushion, like a Mexican knife thrower. He was doing it absently, without much skill. The door opened, and De La Guerra came in. He shut the door and leaned against it, looking woodenly at Marcus. The sandy-haired man creaked his chair around and tilted it back against the desk, scratched his chin with a broad thumbnail. "Hi, Spanish. Nice trip? The chief's yapping for you." De La Guerra grunted, stuck a cigarette between his smooth brown lips. "Were you in Mar's office when those photos were found, Pete?" "Yeah, but I didn't find them. The commish did." "Why? Did you see him find them?" Marcus stared a moment, then said quietly, guardedly, "He found them all right, Sam. He didn't plant them, if that's what you mean." De La Guerra nodded, shrugged. "Anything on the slugs?" "Yeah, not 32s, 25s. A damn vest pocket rod, copper-nickel slugs. An automatic, though, and we didn't find any shells." "Imlay remembered those," De La Guerra said evenly. "But he left without the photos he killed for." Marcus lowered his feet to the floor and leaned forward, looking up past his tawny eyebrows. "That could be. They give him a motive, but with the gun in Mar's hand, they kind of knock a premeditation angle." "Good headwork, Pete." De La Guerra walked over to the small window, stood looking out of it. After a moment, Marcus said dully, "You don't see me doing any work, do you, Spanish?" De La Guerra turned slowly, went over and stood close to Marcus, looking down at him. "Don't be sore, kid. You're my partner, and I'm tagged as Mar's line into headquarters. You're getting some of that. You're sitting still, and I was hiked up to Puma Lake for no good reason except to have a deer carcass planted in the back of my car and have a game warden nick me with it." Marcus stood up very slowly, nodding his fists at his sides. His heavy gray eyes opened very wide. His big nose was white at the nostrils. "Nobody here'd go that far, Sam." De La Guerra shook his head. "I don't think so either, but they could take a hint to send me up there, and somebody outside the department could do the rest." Pete Marcus sat down again. He picked up one of the pointed bank pens and flipped it viciously at the round straw cushion. The point stuck, quivered, broke, and the pen rattled to the floor. "Listen," he said thickly, not looking up. "This is a job to me. That's all it is. A living. I don't have any ideals about this police work like you have. Say the word and I'll heave the goddamn badge in the old boy's puss." De La Guerra bent down, punched him in the ribs. "Skip it, copper. I've got ideas. Go on home and get drunk." He opened the door and went out quickly, walked along a marble-faced corridor to a place where it widened into an alcove with 3 doors. The middle one said, Chief of Detectives entered. De La Guerra went into a small reception room with a plain railing across it. A police stenographer behind the railing looked up, then jerked his head at an inner door. De La Guerra opened a gate in the railing and knocked at the inner door, then went in. 2 men were in the big office. Chief of Detectives Todd McKim sat behind a heavy desk, looked at De La Guerra hard-eyed as he came in. He was a big, loose man who had gone saggy. He had a long, petulantly melancholy face. One of his eyes was not quite straight in his head. The man who sat in a round-backed chair at the end of the desk was dandishly dressed, wore spats. A pearl gray hat and gray gloves and an ebony cane lay beside him on another chair. He had a shock of soft white hair and a handsome dissipated face kept pink by constant massaging. He smiled at De La Guerra, looked vaguely amused and ironical, smoked a cigarette in a long amber holder. De La Guerra sat down opposite McKim. Then he looked at the white-haired man briefly and said, "Good evening, Commissioner." Commissioner Drew nodded offhandedly, didn't speak. McKim leaned forward and clasped blunt, nail-chewed fingers on the shiny desktop. He said quietly, "Took your time reporting back. Find anything?" De la Guerra stared at him, a level, expressionless stare. "I wasn't meant to, except maybe a doe carcass in the back of my car." Nothing changed in McKim's face. Not a muscle of it moved. Drew dragged a pink and polished fingernail across the front of his throat and made a tearing sound with his tongue and teeth. "That's no crack to be making at your boss, lad." De la Guerra kept on looking at McKim, waited. McKim spoke slowly, sadly. "You've got a good record, De la Guerra. Your grandfather was one of the best sheriffs this county ever had. You've blown a lot of dirt on it today. You're charged with violating game laws, interfering with a Toluca County officer in the performance of his duty, and resisting arrest. Got anything to say to all that?" De la Guerra said tonelessly, "Is there a tag out for me?" McKim shook his head very slowly. "It's a department charge. There's no formal complaint. Lack of evidence, I guess." He smiled dryly, without humor. De la Guerra said quietly, "In that case, I guess you'll want my badge." McKim nodded, silent. Drew said, "You're a little quick on the trigger, just a shade fast on the snap-up." De la Guerra took his badge out, rubbed it on his sleeve, looked at it, pushed it across the smooth wood of the desk. "Okay, Chief," he said very softly. "My blood is Spanish, pure Spanish. Not African Mex and not Yaqui Mex. My grandfather would have handled a situation like this with fewer words and more powder smoke. But that doesn't mean I think it's funny. I've been deliberately framed into this spot because I was a close friend of Donegan Marr once. You know and I know that never counted for anything on the job. The commissioner and his political backers may not feel so sure." Drew stood up suddenly. "By God, you'll not talk like that to me," he yelped. De la Guerra smiled slowly. He said nothing, didn't look towards Drew at all. Drew sat down again, scowling, breathing hard. After a moment, McKim scooped the badge into the middle drawer of his desk and got to his feet. "You're suspended for a board, De la Guerra. Keep in touch with me." He went out of the room quickly by the inner door, without looking back. De la Guerra pushed his chair back and straightened his hat on his head. Drew cleared his throat, assumed a conciliatory smile, and said, "Maybe I was a little hasty myself. The Irish in me. Have no hard feelings. The lesson you're learning is something we've all had to learn. Might I give you a word of advice?" De la Guerra stood up, smiled at him. A small, dry smile that moved the corners of his mouth and left the rest of his face wooden. "I know what it is, Commissioner. Lay off the Marr case." Drew laughed, good-humored again. "Not exactly. There isn't any Marr case. Imlay has admitted the shooting through his attorney, claiming self-defense. He's to surrender in the morning. No, my advice was something else. Go back to Toluca County and tell the warden you're sorry. I think that's all that's needed. You might try it and see." De la Guerra moved quietly to the corridor and opened it. Then he looked back with a sudden flashing grin that showed all his white teeth. "I know a crook when I see one, Commissioner. He's been paid for his trouble already." He went out. Drew watched the door close shut with a faint whoosh, a dry click. His face was stiff with rage. His pink skin had turned a doughy gray. His hand shook furiously, holding the amber holder, and ash fell on the knee of his immaculate knife-edged trousers. "By God," he said rigidly in the silence, "you may be a damn smooth Spaniard. You may be smooth as plate glass, but you're a hell of a lot easier to poke a hole through." He rose, awkward with anger, brushed the ashes from his trousers carefully, and reached a hand out for hat and cane. The manicured fingers of the hand were trembling. Chapter 8. Newton Street, between 3rd and 4th, was a block of cheap clothing stores, pawn shops, arcades of slot machines, mean hotels in front of which furtive-eyed men slid words delicately along their cigarettes, without moving their lips. Midway of the block, a jutting wooden sign on a canopy said, "Stoll's Billiard Parlor." Steps went down from the sidewalk edge. De la Guerra went down the steps. It was almost dark in the front of the pool room. The tables were sheeted, the cues racked in rigid lines, but there was light far at the back, hard white light against which clustered heads and shoulders were silhouetted. There was noise, wrangling, shouting of odds. De la Guerra went towards the light. Suddenly, as if at a signal, the noise stopped, and out of the silence came the sharp click of balls, the dull thud of cue ball against cushion after cushion, the final click of a three-bank carom. Then the noise flared up again. De la Guerra stopped beside a sheeted table and got a $10 bill from his wallet, got a small gummed label from a pocket in the wallet. He wrote on it, "Where is Joe?" Pasted it to the bill, folded the bill in four. He went on to the fringe of the crowd and inched his way through until he was close to the table. A tall, pale man with an impassive face and neatly parted brown hair was chalking a cue, studying the setup on the table. He leaned over, bridged with strong white fingers. The betting ring noise dropped like a stone. The tall man made a smooth, effortless three-cushion shot. A chubby-faced man on a high stool intoned, "40 for chill." "Eight's the break." The tall man chalked his cue again, looked around idly. His eyes passed over De la Guerra without sign. De la Guerra stepped closer to him, said, "Back yourself, Max? 5 spot against the next shot." The tall man nodded. "Take it." De la Guerra put the folded bill on the edge of the table. A youth in a striped shirt reached for it. Max Chill blocked him off without seeming to, tucked the bill in a pocket of his vest, said tonelessly, "5 bet," and bent to make another shot. It was a clean crisscross at the top of the table, a hairline shot. There was a lot of applause. The tall man handed his cue to his helper in the striped shirt, said, "Time out. I got to go a place." He went back through the shadows, through a door marked Men. De la Guerra lit a cigarette, looked around at the usual Newton Street riffraff. Max Chill's opponent, another tall, pale, impassive man, stood beside the marker and talked to him without looking at him. Near them, alone and supercilious, a very good-looking Filipino in a smart tan suit was puffing at a chocolate-colored cigarette. Max Chill came back to the table, reached for his cue, chalked it. He reached a hand into his vest, said lazily, "Owe you 5, buddy," passed a folded bill to De la Guerra. He made 3 caroms in a row, almost without stopping. The marker said, 44 for chill, 12's the break. 2 men detached themselves from the edge of the crowd, started towards the entrance. De la Guerra fell in behind them, followed them among the sheeted tables to the foot of the steps. He stopped there, unfolded the bill in his hand, read the address scribbled on the label under his question. He crumpled the bill in his hand, started it towards his pocket. Something hard poked into his back. A twangy voice like a plucked banjo string said, "Help a guy out, huh?" De la Guerra's nostrils quivered, got sharp. He looked up the steps at the legs of the 2 men ahead, at the reflected glare of streetlights. "Okay," the twangy voice said grimly. De la Guerra dropped sidewise, twisting in the air. He shot a snake-like arm back. His hand grabbed an ankle as he fell. A swept gun missed his head, cracked the point of his shoulder, and sent a dart of pain down his left arm. There was hard, hot breathing. Something without force slammed his straw hat. There was a thin, tearing snarl close to him. He rolled, twisted the ankle, tucked a knee under him, and lunged up. He was on his feet, cat-like, lithe. He threw the ankle away from him, hard. The Filipino in the tan suit hit the floor with his back. A gun wobbled up. De la Guerra kicked it out of a small brown hand and it skidded under a table. The Filipino lay still on his back, his head straining up. His snap-brim hat still glued to his oily hair at the back of the pool room. The 3-cushion match went on peacefully. If anyone noticed the scuffling sound, at least no one moved to investigate. De la Guerra jerked a thonged blackjack from his hip pocket, bent over. The Filipino's tight brown face cringed. "Got lots to learn." "On the feet, baby." De la Guerra's voice was chilled but casual. The dark man scrambled up, lifted his arms, then his left hand snaked for his right shoulder. The blackjack knocked it down with a careless flip of De la Guerra's wrist. The brown man screamed thinly like a hungry kitten. De la Guerra shrugged. His mouth moved in a sardonic grin. "Stick up, huh?" "Okay, Yellowpuss, some other time. I'm busy now." "Dust." The Filipino slid back among the tables, crouched down. De la Guerra shifted the blackjack to his left hand, shot his right to a gun butt. He stood for a moment like that, watching the Filipino's eyes. Then he turned and went quickly up the steps, out of sight. The brown man darted forward along the wall, crept under the table for his gun. Chapter 9. Joey Chill, who jerked the door open, held a short, worn gun without a foresight. He was a small man, hard-bitten, with a tight, worried face. He needed a shave and a clean shirt. A harsh animal smell came out of the room behind him. He lowered the gun, grinned sourly, stepped back into the room. "Okay, copper, took your sweet time getting here." De la Guerra went in and shut the door. He pushed his straw hat far back on his wiry hair and looked at Joey Chill without any expression. He said, "Am I supposed to remember the address of every punk in town? I had to get it from Max." The small man growled something and went and lay down on the bed, shoved his gun under the pillow. He clasped his hands behind his head and blinked at the ceiling. "Got a C-note on you, copper?" De la Guerra jerked a straight chair in front of the bed and straddled it. He got his bulldog pipe out, filled it slowly, looking with distaste at the shut window, the chipped enamel of the bed frame, the dirty, tumbled bedclothes, the wash bowl in the corner with 2 smeared towels hung over it, the bare dresser with half a bottle of gin planked on top of the Gideon Bible. "Hold up?" he inquired without much interest. "I'm hot, copper. I'm hot. I got something, see? It's worth a C-note." De la Guerra put his pouch away slowly, indifferently, held a lighted match to his pipe, puffed with exasperating leisure. The small man on the bed fidgeted, watching him with sidelong looks. De la Guerra said slowly, "You're a good stoolie, Joey. I'll always say that for you. But $100 is important money to a copper." "Worth it, guy, if you like the mar killing well enough to want to break it right." De la Guerra's eyes got steady and very cold. His teeth clamped on the pipe stem. He spoke very quietly, very grimly. "I'll listen, Joey. I'll pay if it's worth it. It better be right, though." The small man rolled over on his elbow. "Know who the girl was with Imlay in those pajama snaps?" "Know her name," De la Guerra said evenly. "I haven't seen the pictures." "Stella Lamotte's a huffer name. Real name Stella Chill, my kid sister." De la Guerra folded his arms on the back of the chair. "That's nice," he said. "Go on." "She framed him, copper. Framed him for a few bindles of heroin from a slant-eyed Flip." "Flip?" De la Guerra spoke the word swiftly, harshly. His face was tense now. "Yeah, a little brown brother. A looker, a neat dresser, a snow peddler, a goddamn dodo. Name Torribo. They call him the Caliente Kid. He had a place across the hall from Stella. He got to feeding her the stuff. Then he works her into the frame. She puts heavy drops in Imlay's liquor and he passes out. She lets the Flip in to shoot pictures with a mini camera. Cute, huh? And then, just like a broad, she gets sorry and spills the whole thing to Max and me." De la Guerra nodded. Silent, almost rigid, the little man grinned sharply, showed his small teeth. "What do? I take a plant on the Flip. I live in his shadow, copper, and after a while I tail him bang into Dave Age's skyline apartment in the Vendome." I guess that rate's a yard. De la Guerra nodded slowly, shook a little ash into the palm of his hand and blew it off. Who else knows this? Max. He'll back me up if you handle him right. Only he don't want any part of it. He don't play those games. He gave Stella dough to leave town and signed off. Because those boys are tough. Max couldn't know where you followed the Filipino to, Joey. The small man sat up sharply, swung his feet to the floor. His face got sullen. I'm not kidding you, copper. I never have. De la Guerra said quietly, I believe you, Joey. I'd like more proof, though. What do you make of it? The little man snorted. Hell, it sticks up so hard it hurts. Either the flip's working for Masters an age before, or he makes a deal with them after he gets the snaps. Then Mar gets the pictures, and it's a cinch he don't get them unless they say so, and he don't know they had them. Imlay was running for judge, on their ticket. Okay, he's their punk, but he's still a punk. It happens he's a guy who drinks and has a nasty temper. That's known. De la Guerra's eyes glistened a little. The rest of his face was like carved wood. The pipe in his mouth was as motionless as though set in cement. Joey Chill went on with his sharp little grin. So they deal the big one. They get the pictures to Mar without Mar's knowing where they came from. Then Imlay gets tipped off who has them, what they are, that Mar is set to put the squeeze on him. What would a guy like Imlay do? He'd go hunting, copper, and Big John Masters and his sidekick would eat the ducks. Or the venison, De la Guerra said absently. Huh? Well, does it rate? De la Guerra reached for his wallet, shook the money out of it, counted some bills on his knee. He rolled them into a tight wad and flipped them onto the bed. I'd like a line to Stella pretty well, Joey. How about it? The small man stuffed the money in his shirt pocket, shook his head. No can do. You might try Max again. I think she's left town, and I'm doing that too. Now I've got the scratch. Because those boys are tough, like I said, and maybe I didn't tail so good, because some mug's been tailing me. He stood up, yawned, added, Snort of gin? De la Guerra shook his head, watched the little man go over to the dresser and lift the gin bottle, pour a big dose into a thick glass. He drained the glass, started to put it down. Glass tinkled at the window. There was a sound like the loose slap of a glove. A small piece of the window glass dropped to the bare stained wood beyond the carpet, almost at Joey Chill's feet. The little man stood quite motionless for 2 or 3 seconds. Then the glass fell from his hand, bounced and rolled against the wall. Then his legs gave. He went down on his side, slowly, rolled slowly over on his back. Blood began to move sluggishly down his cheek from a hole over his left eye. It moved faster. The hole got large and red. Joey Chill's eyes looked blankly at the ceiling, as if those things no longer concerned him at all. De la Guerra slipped quietly down out of the chair to his hands and knees. He crawled along the side of the bed, over to the wall by the window, reached out from there and groped inside Joey Chill's shirt. He held fingers against his heart for a little while, took them away, shook his head. He squatted down low, took his hat off, and pushed his head up very carefully until he could see over a lower corner of the window. He looked at the high blank wall of a storage warehouse, across an alley. There were scattered windows in it, high up, none of them lighted. De la Guerra pulled his head down again, said quietly under his breath, Silenced rifle, maybe. And very sweet shooting. His hand went forward again, diffidently, took the little roll of bills from Joey Chill's shirt. He went back along the wall to the door, still crouched, reached up and got the key from the door, opened it, straightened and stepped through quickly, locked the door from the outside. He went along a dirty corridor and down 4 flights of steps to a narrow lobby. The lobby was empty. There was a desk and a bell on it, no one behind it. De la Guerra stood behind the plate-glass street door and looked across the street at a frame rooming house where a couple of old men rocked on the porch, smoking. They looked very peaceful. He watched them for a couple of minutes. He went out, searched both sides of the block quickly with sharp glances, walked along beside parked cars to the next corner. 2 blocks over, he picked up a cab and rode back to Stoll's billiard parlors on Newton Street. Lights were lit all over the pool room now. Balls clicked and spun. Players weaved in and out of a thick haze of cigarette smoke. De la Guerra looked around, then went to where a chubby-faced man sat on a high stool beside a cash register. "You stole?" The chubby-faced man nodded. "Where did Max Chill get to?" "Long gone, brother. They only played 100 up. Home, I guess." "Where's home?" The chubby-faced man gave him a swift, flickering glance that passed like a finger of light. "I wouldn't know." De la Guerra lifted a hand to the pocket where he carried his badge. He dropped it again, tried not to drop it too quickly. The chubby-faced man grinned. "Flatty, eh? Okay, he lives at the Mansfield, 3 blocks west on Grand." Chapter 10. Ceferino Torribo, the good-looking Filipino in the well-cut tan suit, gathered 2 dimes and 3 pennies off the counter in the telegraph office, smiled at the bored blonde who was waiting on him. "That goes out right away, sugar?" She glanced at the message icily. "Hotel Mansfield? Be there in 20 minutes and save the sugar." "Okay, sugar." Torribo dawdled elegantly out of the office. The blonde spiked the message with a jab, said over her shoulder, "Guy must be nuts, sending a wire to a hotel 3 blocks away." Ceferino Torribo strolled along Spring Street, trailing smoke over his neat shoulder from a chocolate-colored cigarette. At 4th he turned west, went 3 blocks more, turned into the side entrance of the Mansfield by the barber shop. He went up some marble steps to a mezzanine, along the back of a writing room and up carpeted steps to the 3rd floor. He passed the elevators and swaggered down a long corridor to the end, looking at the numbers on doors. He came back halfway to the elevators, sat down in an open space where there was a pair of windows on the court, a glass-topped table and chairs. He lit a fresh cigarette from his stub, leaned back and listened to the elevators. He leaned forward sharply whenever one stopped at that floor, listening for steps. The steps came in something over 10 minutes. He stood up and went to the corner of the wall where the widened-out space began. He took a long, thin gun out from under his right arm, transferred it to his right hand, held it down against the wall beside his leg. A squat, pockmarked Filipino in bellhop's uniform came along the corridor, carrying a small tray. Torribo made a hissing noise, lifted the gun. The squat Filipino whirled. His mouth opened and his eyes bulged at the gun. Torribo said, "What room, punk?" The squat Filipino smiled very nervously, placatingly. He came close, showed Torribo a yellow envelope on his tray. The figures 338 were penciled on the window of the envelope. "Put it down," Torribo said calmly. The squat Filipino put the telegram on the table. He kept his eyes on the gun. "Beat it," Torribo said. "You put it under the door, see?" The squat Filipino ducked his round black head, smiled nervously again, and went away very quickly towards the elevators. Torribo put the gun in his jacket pocket, took out a folded white paper. He opened it very carefully, shook glistening white powder from it, onto the hollow place formed between his left thumb and forefinger when he spread his hand. He sniffed the powder sharply up his nose, took out a flame-colored silk handkerchief and wiped his nose. He stood still for a little while. His eyes got the dullness of slate and the skin on his brown face seemed to tighten over his high cheekbones. He breathed audibly between his teeth. He picked the yellow envelope up and went along the corridor to the end, stopped in front of the last door, knocked. A voice called out. He put his lips close to the door, spoke in a high-pitched, very deferential voice. "Mail for you, sir." Bed springs creaked. Steps came across the floor inside. A key turned and the door opened. Toribo had his thin gun out again by this time. As the door opened, he stepped swiftly into the opening, sidewise, with a graceful sway of his hips. He put the muzzle of the thin gun against Max Chill's abdomen. "Back up!" he snarled, and his voice now had the metallic twang of a plucked banjo string. Max Chill backed away from the gun. He backed across the room to the bed, sat down on the bed when his legs struck the side of it. Springs creaked and a newspaper rustled. Max Chill's pale face under the neatly parted brown hair had no expression at all. Toribo shut the door softly, snapped the lock. When the door latch snapped, Max Chill's face suddenly became a sick face. His lips began to shake, kept on shaking. Toribo said mockingly in his twangy voice, "You talk to the cops, huh? Adios." The thin gun jumped in his hand, kept on jumping. A little pale smoke lisped from the muzzle. The noise the gun made was no louder than a hammer striking a nail or knuckles rapping sharply on wood. It made that noise 7 times. Max Chill lay down on the bed very slowly. His feet stayed on the floor. His eyes went blank, and his lips parted and a pinkish froth seethed on them. Blood showed in several places on the front of his loose shirt. He lay quite still on his back and looked at the ceiling with his feet touching the floor and the pink froth bubbling on his blue lips. Toribo moved the gun to his left hand and put it away under his arm. He sidled over to the bed and stood beside it, looking down at Max Chill. After a while, the pink froth stopped bubbling and Max Chill's face became the quiet, empty face of a dead man. Toribo went back to the door, opened it, started to back out, his eyes still on the bed. There was a stir of movement behind him. He started to whirl, snatching a hand up. Something looped at his head. The floor tilted queerly before his eyes, rushed up at his face. He didn't know when it struck his face. De la Guerra kicked the Filipino's legs into the room, out of the way of the door. He shut the door, locked it, walked stiffly over to the bed, swinging a thonged sap at his side. He stood beside the bed for quite a long time. At last he said under his breath, "They clean up. Yeah, they clean up." He went back to the Filipino, rolled him over and went through his pockets. There was a well-lined wallet without any identification, a gold lighter set with garnets, a gold cigarette case, keys, a gold pencil and knife, the flame-colored handkerchief, loose money, 2 guns and spare clips for them, and 5 bindles of heroin powder in the ticket pocket of the tan jacket. He left it thrown around on the floor, stood up. The Filipino breathed heavily, with his eyes shut, a muscle twitching in one cheek. De la Guerra took a coil of thin wire out of his pocket and wired the brown man's wrists behind him. He dragged him over to the bed, sat him up against the leg, looped a strand of the wire around his neck and around the bedpost. He tied the flame-colored handkerchief to the looped wire. He went into the bathroom and got a glass of water and threw it into the Filipino's face as hard as he could throw it. Toribo jerked, gagged sharply as the wire caught his neck. His eyes jumped open. He opened his mouth to yell. De la Guerra jerked the wire taut against the brown throat. The yell was cut off as though by a switch. There was a strained, anguished gurgle. Toribo's mouth drooled. De la Guerra let the wire go slack again and put his head down close to the Filipino's head. He spoke to him gently, with a dry, very deadly gentleness. "You want to talk to me, Spig? Maybe not right away, maybe not even soon, but after a while you want to talk to me." The Filipino's eyes rolled yellowly. He spat. Then his lips came together, tight. De la Guerra smiled a faint, grim smile. "Tough boy," he said softly. He jerked the handkerchief back, held it tight and hard, biting into the brown throat above the Adam's apple. The Filipino's legs began to jump on the floor. His body moved in sudden lunges. The brown of his face became a thick, congested purple. His eyes bulged, shot with blood. De la Guerra let the wire go loose again. The Filipino gasped air into his lungs. His head sagged, then jerked back against the bedpost. He shook with a chill. "See, I talk," he breathed. Chapter 11. When the bell rang, Ironhead Toomey very carefully put a black 10 down on a red jack. Then he licked his lips and put all the cards down and looked around towards the front door of the bungalow. Through the dining room arch, he stood up slowly, a big brute of a man with loose gray hair and a big nose. In the living room beyond the arch, a thin blonde girl was lying on a davenport, reading a magazine under a lamp with a torn red shade. She was pretty, but too pale, and her thin, high-arched eyebrows gave her face a startled look. She put the magazine down and swung her feet to the floor and looked at Ironhead Toomey with sharp, sudden fear in her eyes. Toomey jerked his thumb silently. The girl stood up and went very quickly through the arch and through a swing door into the kitchen. She shut the swing door slowly, so that it made no noise. The bell rang again, longer. Toomey shoved his white-socked feet into carpet slippers, hung a pair of glasses on his big nose, took a revolver off a chair beside him. He picked a crumpled newspaper off the floor and arranged it loosely in front of the gun, which he held in his left hand. He strolled unhurriedly to the front door. He was yawning as he opened it, peering with sleepy eyes through the glasses at the tall man who stood on the porch. "Okay," he said wearily. "Talk it up." De la Guerra said, "I'm a police officer. I want to see Stella Lamotte." Ironhead Toomey put an arm like a Yule log across the door frame and leaned solidly against it. His expression remained bored. "Wrong dump, copper. No broads here." De la Guerra said, "I'll come in and look." Toomey said cheerfully, "You will? Like hell." De la Guerra jerked a gun out of his pocket very smoothly and swiftly, smashed it at Toomey's left wrist. The newspaper and the big revolver fell down on the floor of the porch. Toomey's face got a less bored expression. "Old gag," De la Guerra snapped. "Let's go in." Toomey shook his left wrist, took his other arm off the doorframe and swung hard at De la Guerra's jaw. De la Guerra moved his head about 4 inches. He frowned, made a disapproving noise with his tongue and lips. Toomey dived at him. De la Guerra sidestepped and chopped the gun at a big gray head. Toomey landed on his stomach, half in the house and half out on the porch. He grunted, planted his hands firmly and started to get up again as if nothing had hit him. De la Guerra kicked Toomey's gun out of the way. A swing door inside the house made a light sound. Toomey was up on one knee and one hand as De la Guerra looked towards the noise. He took a swing at De la Guerra's stomach, hit him. De la Guerra grunted and hit Toomey on the head again, hard. Toomey shook his head, growled, "Sappin' me is a waste of time, Bo." He dived sidewise, got hold of De la Guerra's leg, jerked the leg off the floor. De la Guerra sat down on the boards of the porch, jammed in the doorway. His head hit the side of the doorway, dazed him. The thin blonde rushed through the arch with a small automatic in her hand. She pointed it at De la Guerra, said furiously, "Reach, damn you!" De la Guerra shook his head, started to say something, then caught his breath as Toomey twisted his foot. Toomey set his teeth hard and twisted the foot as if he was all alone in the world with it, and it was his foot, and he could do what he liked with it. De la Guerra's head jerked back again, and his face got white. His mouth twisted into a harsh grimace of pain. He heaved up, grabbed Toomey's hair with his left hand, dragged the big head up and over until his chin came up, straining. De la Guerra smashed the barrel of his Colt on the skin. Toomey became limp, an inert mass, fell across his legs and pinned him to the floor. De la Guerra couldn't move. He was propped on the floor on his right hand, trying to keep from being pushed flat by Toomey's weight. He couldn't get his right hand with the gun in it off the floor. The blonde was closer to him now, wild-eyed, white-faced with rage. De la Guerra said in a spent voice, "Don't be a fool, Stella, Joey." The blonde's face was unnatural. Her eyes were unnatural, with small pupils, a queer flat glitter in them. "Cops?" she almost screamed. "Cops! God, how I hate cops!" The gun in her hand crashed. The echoes of it filled the room, went out of the open front door, died against the high board fence across the street. A sharp blow like the blow of a club hit the left side of De la Guerra's head. Pain filled his head. Light flared, blinding white light that filled the world. Then it was dark. He fell soundlessly into bottomless darkness. Chapter 12. Light came back as a red fog in front of his eyes. Hard, bitter pain racked the side of his head, his whole face ground in his teeth. His tongue was hot and thick when he tried to move it. He tried to move his hands. They were far away from him, not his hands at all. Then he opened his eyes, and the red fog went away, and he was looking at a face. It was a big face, very close to him, a huge face. It was fat and had sleek blue jowls, and there was a cigar with a bright band in a grinning, thick-lipped mouth. The face chuckled. De la Guerra closed his eyes again, and the pain washed over him, submerged him. He passed out. Seconds or years passed. He was looking at the face again. He heard a thick voice. "Well, he's with us again. A pretty tough lad at that." The face came closer. The end of the cigar glowed cherry red. Then he was coughing rackingly, gagging on smoke. The side of his head seemed to burst open. He felt fresh blood slide down his cheekbone, tickling the skin, then slide over stiff, dried blood that had already caked on his face. "That fixes him up swell," the thick voice said. Another voice with a touch of brogue to it said something gentle and obscene. The big face whirled towards the sound, snarling. De la Guerra came wide awake then. He saw the room clearly, saw the 4 people in it. The big face was the face of Big John Masters. The thin blonde girl was hunched on one end of the davenport, staring at the floor with a doped expression, her arms stiff at her sides, her hands out of sight in the cushions. Dave Age had his long, lank body propped against a wall beside a curtained window. His wedge-shaped face looked bored. Commissioner Drew was on the other end of the davenport, under the frayed lamp. The light made silver in his hair. His blue eyes were very bright, very intent. There was a shiny gun in Big John Masters' hand. De la Guerra blinked at it, started to get up. A hard hand jerked at his chest, jarred him back. A wave of nausea went over him. The thick voice said harshly, "Hold it, pussyfoot. You've had your fun. This is our party." De la Guerra licked his lips, said, "Give me a drink of water." Dave Age stood away from the wall and went through the dining room arch. He came back with a glass, held it to De la Guerra's mouth. De la Guerra drank. Masters said, "We like your guts, copper, but you don't use them right. It seems you're a guy that can't take a hint. That's too bad. That makes you through. Get me?" The blonde turned her head and looked at De la Guerra with heavy eyes, looked away again. Aju went back to his wall. Drew began to stroke the side of his face with quick, nervous fingers, as if De la Guerra's bloody head made his own face hurt. De la Guerra said slowly, "Killing me will just hang you a little higher, Masters. A sucker on the big time is still a sucker. You've had 2 men killed already for no reason at all. You don't even know what you're trying to cover." The big man swore harshly, jerked the shiny gun up, then lowered it slowly with a heavy leer. Age said indolently, "Take it easy, John. Let him speak his piece." De la Guerra said in the same slow, careless voice, "The lady over there is the sister of the 2 men you've had killed." She told them her story about framing Imlay, who got the pictures, how they got to Donegan Mar. "Your little Filipino hood has done some singing." I get the general idea, all right. You couldn't be sure Imlay would kill Mar. Maybe Mar would get Imlay. It would work out all right either way. Only if Imlay did kill Mar, the case had to be broken fast. That's where you slipped. You started to cover up before you really knew what happened. Masters said harshly, "Crummy copper, crummy, you're wasting my time." The blonde turned her head towards De La Guerra, towards Masters' back. There was hard green hate in her eyes now. De La Guerra shrugged very slightly, went on. "It was routine stuff for you to put killers on the Chill brothers. It was routine stuff to get me off the investigation, get me framed and suspended because you figured I was on Mar's payroll. But it wasn't routine when you couldn't find Imlay and that crowded you." Masters' hard black eyes got wide and empty. His thick neck swelled. Age came away from the wall a few feet and stood rigidly. After a moment, Masters snapped his teeth, spoke very quietly. "That's a honey, Copper. Tell us about that one." De La Guerra touched his smeared face with the tips of 2 fingers, looked at the fingers. His eyes were depthless, ancient. "Imlay is dead, Masters. He was dead before Mar was killed." The room was very still. Nobody moved in it. The 4 people De La Guerra looked at were frozen with shock. After a long time, Masters drew in a harsh breath and blew it out and almost whispered, "Tell it, Copper. Tell it fast, or by God I'll—" De La Guerra's voice cut in on him coldly, without any emotion at all. "Imlay went to see Mar all right. Why wouldn't he? He didn't know he was double-crossed. Only he went to see him last night, not today. He rode up to the cabin at Puma Lake with him, to talk things over in a friendly way. That was the gag, anyhow. Then, up there, they had their fight, and Imlay got killed. Got dumped off the end of the porch, got his head smashed open on some rocks. He's dead as last Christmas, in the woodshed of Mar's cabin. Okay, Mar hid him and came back to town. Then today he got a phone call mentioning the name Imlay, making a date for 12:15. What would Mar do? Stall, of course, send his office girl off to lunch, put a gun where he could reach it in a hurry. He was all set for trouble then. Only the visitor fooled him, and he didn't use the gun. Masters said gruffly, "Hell, man, you're just cracking wise. You couldn't know all those things." He looked back at Drew. Drew was gray-faced, taut. Age came a little farther away from the wall and stood close to Drew. The blonde girl didn't move a muscle. De La Guerra said wearily, "Sure, I'm guessing, but I'm guessing to fit the facts. It had to be like that. Mar was no slouch with a gun, and he was on edge, all set. Why didn't he get a shot in? Because it was a woman that called on him." He lifted an arm, pointed at the blonde. "There's your killer. She loved Imlay, even though she framed him. She's a junkie, and junkies are like that. She got sad and sorry, and she went after Mar herself. Ask her." The blonde stood up in a smooth lunge. Her right hand jerked up from the cushions with a small automatic in it, the one she had shot De La Guerra with. Her green eyes were pale and empty and staring. Masters whirled around, flailed at her arm with the shiny revolver. She shot him twice, point blank, without a flicker of hesitation. Blood spurted from the side of his thick neck, down the front of his coat. He staggered, dropped the shiny revolver, almost at De La Guerra's feet. He fell outwards towards the wall behind De La Guerra's chair, one arm groping out for the wall. His hand hit the wall and trailed down it as he fell. He crashed heavily, didn't move again. De La Guerra had the shiny revolver almost in his hand. Drew was on his feet, yelling. The girl turned slowly towards Age, seemed to ignore De La Guerra. Age jerked a Luger from under his arm and knocked Drew out of the way with his arm. The small automatic and the Luger roared at the same time. The small gun missed. The girl was flung down on the davenport, her left hand clutching at her breast. She rolled her eyes, tried to lift the gun again. Then she fell sidewise on the cushions, and her left hand went lax, dropped away from her breast. The front of her dress was a sudden welter of blood. Her eyes opened and shut, opened and stayed open. Odge swung the Luger towards De la Guerra. His eyebrows were twisted up into a sharp grin of intense strain. His smoothly combed, sand-colored hair flowed down his bony scalp as tightly as though it were painted on it. De la Guerra shot him 4 times, so rapidly that the explosions were like the rattle of a machine gun. In the instant of time before he fell, Odge's face became the thin, empty face of an old man, his eyes the vacant eyes of an idiot. Then his long body jackknifed to the floor, the Luger still in his hand. One leg doubled under him as if there was no bone in it. Powder smell was sharp in the air. The air was stunned by the sound of guns. De la Guerra got to his feet slowly, motioned to Drew with the shiny revolver. "Your party, Commissioner. Is this anything like what you wanted?" Drew nodded slowly, white-faced, quivering. He swallowed, moved slowly across the floor, past Odge's sprawled body. He looked down at the girl on the davenport, shook his head. He went over to Masters, went down on one knee, touched him. He stood up again. "All dead, I think," he muttered. De la Guerra said, "That's swell. What happened to the big boy, the bruiser?" "They sent him away." I don't think they meant to kill you, De la Guerra." De la Guerra nodded a little. His face began to soften. The rigid lines began to go out of it. The side that was not a blood-stained mask began to look human again. He sopped at his face with a handkerchief. It came away bright red with blood. He threw it away and lightly fingered his matted hair into place. Some of it was caught in the dried blood. "The hell they didn't," he said. The house was very still. There was no noise outside. Drew listened, sniffed, went to the front door and looked out. The street outside was dark, silent. He came back close to De la Guerra. Very slowly a smile worked itself onto his face. "It's a hell of a note," he said. "When a commissioner of police has to be his own undercover man, and a square cop had to be framed off the force to help him." De la Guerra looked at him without expression. "You want to play it that way?" Drew spoke calmly now. The pink was back in his face. "For the good of the department, man, and the city and ourselves, it's the only way to play it." De la Guerra looked him straight in the eyes. "I like it that way too," he said in a dead voice. "If it gets played exactly that way." Chapter 13. Marcus braked the car to a stop and grinned admiringly at the big tree-shaded house. "Pretty nice," he said. "I could go for a long rest there myself." De la Guerra got out of the car slowly, as if he was stiff and very tired. He was hatless, carried his straw under his arm. Part of the left side of his head was shaved, and the shaved part covered by a thick pad of gauze and tape over the stitches. A wick of wiry black hair stuck up over one edge of the bandage, with a ludicrous effect. He said, "Yeah, but I'm not staying here, Sap. Wait for me." He went along the path of stones that wound through the grass. Trees speared long shadows across the lawn, through the morning sunlight. The house was very still, with drawn blinds, a dark wreath on the brass knocker. De la Guerra didn't go up to the door. He turned off along another path under the windows and went along the side of the house past the gladioli beds. There were more trees at the back, more lawn, more flowers, more sun and shadow. There was a pond with water lilies in it, and a big stone bullfrog. Beyond was a half-circle of lawn chairs around an iron table with a tile top. In one of the chairs Belmar sat. She wore a black and white dress, loose and casual, and there was a wide-brimmed garden hat on her chestnut hair. She sat very still, looking into the distance across the lawn. Her face was white. The makeup glared on it. She turned her head slowly, smiled a dull smile, motioned to a chair beside her. De la Guerra didn't sit down. He took his straw from under his arm, snapped a finger at the brim, said, "The case is closed. There'll be inquests, investigations, threats, a lot of people shouting their mouths off to horn in on the publicity, that sort of thing. The papers will play it big for a while, but underneath, on the record, it's closed. You can begin to try to forget it." The girl looked at him suddenly, widened her vivid blue eyes, looked away again over the grass. "Is your head very bad, Sam?" she asked softly. De la Guerra said, "No, it's fine. What I mean is the Lamotte girl shot Masters, and she shot Donnie. Age shot her. I shot Age. All dead, ring around the rosy. Just how Imlay got killed we'll not know ever, I guess. I can't see that it matters now." Without looking up at him, Belmar said quietly, "But how did you know it was Imlay up at the cabin?" "The paper said—" She broke off, shuddered suddenly. He stared woodenly at the hat he was holding. "I didn't. I thought a woman shot Donnie. It looked like a good hunch that was Imlay up at the lake. It fitted his description. How did you know it was a woman?" "That killed Donnie?" Her voice had a lingering, half-whispered stillness. "I just knew." He walked away a few steps, stood looking at the trees. He turned slowly, came back, stood beside her chair again. His face was very weary. "We had great times together, the three of us, you and Donnie and I. Life seems to do nasty things to people. It's all gone now, all the good part." Her voice was still a whisper, saying, "Maybe not all gone, Sam. We must see a lot of each other from now on." A vague smile moved the corners of his lips, went away again. "It's my first frame up," he said quietly. "I hope it will be my last." Belmar's head jerked a little. Her hands took hold of the arms of the chair, looked white against the varnished wood. Her whole body seemed to get rigid. After a moment, De la Guerra reached in his pocket and something gold glittered in his hand. He looked down at it dully. "Got the badge back," he said. "It's not quite as clean as it was. Clean as most, I suppose. I'll try to keep it that way." He put it back in his pocket. Very slowly the girl stood up in front of him. She lifted her chin, stared at him with a long, level stare. Her face was a mask of white plaster behind the rouge. She said, "My God, Sam, I begin to understand." De la Guerra didn't look at her face. He looked past her shoulder at some vague spot in the distance. He spoke vaguely, distantly. "Sure. I thought it was a woman because it was a small gun such as a woman would use, but not only on that account. After I went up to the cabin, I knew Donnie was primed for trouble, and it wouldn't be that easy for a man to get the drop on him, but it was a perfect setup for Imlay to have done it. Masters and Age assumed he'd done it and had a lawyer phone in admitting he did it and promising to surrender him in the morning. So it was natural for anyone who didn't know Imlay was dead to fall in line. Besides, no cop would expect a woman to pick up her shells. After I got Joey Chill's story, I thought it might be the Lamotte girl, but I didn't think so when I said it in front of her. That was dirty. It got her killed in a way. Though I wouldn't give much for her chances anyway with that bunch." Belmar was still staring at him. The breeze blew a wisp of her hair, and that was the only thing about her that moved. He brought his eyes back from the distance, looked at her gravely for a brief moment, looked away again. He took a small bunch of keys out of his pocket, tossed them down on the table. "Three things were tough to figure until I got completely wise. The writing on the pad, the gun in Donnie's hand, the missing shells. Then I tumbled to it. He didn't die right away. He had guts, and he used them to the last flicker, to protect somebody. The writing on the pad was a bit shaky. He wrote it afterwards, when he was alone, dying. He had been thinking of Imlay, and writing the name helped mess the trial. Then he got the gun out of his desk to die with it in his hand. That left the shells. I got that too after a while. The shots were fired close, across the desk, and there were books on one end of the desk. The shells fell there, stayed on the desk where he could get them. He couldn't have got them off the floor. There's a key to the office on your ring. I went there last night late. I found the shells in a humidor with his cigars. Nobody looked for them there. You only find what you expect to find, after all. He stopped talking and rubbed the side of his face. After a moment he added, Donnie did the best he could, and then he died. It was a swell job, and I'm letting him get away with it. Belmar opened her mouth slowly. A kind of babble came out of it first, then words, clear words. It wasn't just women, Sam. It was the kind of women he had. She shivered. I'll go downtown now and give myself up. De la Guerra said, No. I told you I was letting him get away with it. Downtown they like it the way it is. It's swell politics. It gets the city out from under the master's age mob. It puts Drew on top for a little while, but he's too weak to last. So that doesn't matter. You're not going to do anything about any of it. You're going to do what Donnie used his last strength to show he wanted. You're staying out. Goodbye. He looked at her white, shattered face once more, very quickly. Then he swung around, walked away over the lawn, past the pool with the lily pads and the stone bullfrog along the side of the house and out to the car. Pete Marcus swung the door open. De la Guerra got in and sat down and put his head far back against the seat, slumped down in the car and closed his eyes. He said flatly, Take it easy, Pete. My head hurts like hell. Marcus started the car and turned into the street, drove slowly back along Deneve Lane towards town. The tree-shaded house disappeared behind them. The tall trees finally hid it. When they were a long way from it, De la Guerra opened his eyes again. End of Spanish Blood by Raymond Chandler.